Hey folks, in today's beta studies for Resto Druid DPS, we are going to be looking at the Conduit system and which ones will be the best for dealing damage with both Feral Affinity and Balance Affinity. Let's get started. Firstly, let's briefly go over what Conduits are. They are minor ability buffs that are socketed into your soulbinds, and you will have 4 slots per soulbind that you can use, split between Potency, that's output, Finesse, which is more utility, and defensive ones which don't provide DPS, so we won't talk about them. So before we begin with the Potency Conduits, let's talk about the Finesse ones. As a healer, technically doing DPS is a utility, so here we have a Conduit that helps dealing damage, Born of the Wild. And this reduces the cooldown of Heart of the Wild, and some other CC things if you don't take Heart of the Wild, by 10%. Since you'll be taking Heart of the Wild if you want to deal the most damage, you'll want this for your first Finesse slot. If you have a second slot, which will depend on your soulbind, something that we will look into in a future video, you have 2 choices. Front of the pack buffs up Stampeding Roar, but I believe Born Anew, which causes Rebirth to also apply Well-Fed to the target, will likely be better, as those Well-Fed stats equate to damage, and most of the time you'll be resing a DPS player. For Potency, you have to ask yourself, should I be going for damage or healing? Some damage ones will work for you, but just because you can, doesn't mean you should. Well, that's up to you. I know my current plan is to use 2 different soulbinds for healing, one which will have more DPS focused conduits inside, and one which will have more healing focused conduits inside. Luckily, the best conduit for damage also happens to be the only one that increases healing as well as damage, and that conduit is... well, it depends on your covenant, as it increases the power of your covenant ability. Conflux of the Elements for Night Fae, Evolved Swarm for the Necrolords, Endless Thirst for the Venthyr, and Deep Allegiance for Kyrian. Now these numbers on screen are pretty vague and fairly flawed. Note that these figures are based on a template character's gear and don't account for the ability itself, only the bonus that this conduit gives. The Kyrian one is a bad ability for Resto DPS anyway, so I'd advise against it, but the rest rely on a few factors. The Venthyr relies on 100% uptime of damage dealing during those 20 seconds. The Necrolord relies on about a 75% uptime for its DPS version across the entire encounter, with 100% uptime on all 4 dots, and if you're Balance Affinity then that number is going to be weaker as you only have 2 dots. The Night Fae one does not account for the fact that it deals increased AoE damage and heals during its 4-second cast. Whatever the figures though, these are going to be your best conduits for Potency, not only because they buff healing too, but the damage numbers are just better than all the rest that we'll come across. As for the second best, for Cat Weaving, on paper it's Sudden Ambush. This causes finishers to occasionally treat Rip or Shred to act as if you were stealth, dealing extra damage and either stunning or having a higher crit chance. Sounds good, but in practice it doesn't really work this way, and this is a fundamental flaw in Cat Weaving DPS. You are a healer, and therefore you will need to spend time, occasionally, having to heal. So here, the moment you add a second target or have to break your DPS rotation, keeping a constant chain of finishers to sometimes buff up Shred just won't happen. Incandescent Hunter and Taste for Blood just won't pull much weight in any scenario. Looking at the Mythic Plus logs, which itself is slightly flawed as corruption damage and a few other things will not be available on Shadowlands, we can see how much damage over a dungeon Sunfire and Moonfire do. Even if we cut Sunfire's damage down to 75% due to the loss of High Noon, that still makes up 25% of the damage when corruptions are removed. If we treat the Mythic Plus as a real scenario, we can multiply by its usage and find that Fury of the Skies will come out ahead. This causes Moonfire and Sunfire to increase arcane and nature damage you deal to the target by 3%. Even as a cat, using just Moonfire and Sunfire, based on how much you'll be using these spells, you'll find they outperform the Feral Potency Conduit in a real life scenario. This conduit does become weaker the more time you spend in cat form dealing damage, but if you find yourself spending more of the dungeon having to heal, then this pulls out ahead even further. That is before taking into account that Balance Affinity would benefit even more so, as Wrath and Starfire will also benefit from the 3% buff. I don't have Our Weaving logged, so I have to make an educated guess, but while the numbers are good, this still won't surpass the Covenant ability Conduits. The other balanced Conduits all work with the Eclipse mechanic, which is something you have as Resto, but no ability mentions it. Overall, it's just very weird, and honestly there's no way they will outdo Fury of the Skies. So what to take away from this? From a purely Conduit perspective, the best Conduits, for dealing damage at least, will be your Covenant ability one in the first potency slot, then Fury of the Skies in the second, if you have a second. Or put in a healing potency, because you're a healer and it's perfectly valid to put in healer Conduits. For finesse, Born of the Wilds is the given, and then Born Anew if your route happens to have a second. Next time won't be Soulbinds. I want to cover legendaries first, and then we'll go over each of the Covenants. Before we end though, I do want to briefly mention something that I missed in the Heart of the Wilds video, which was Cat versus Owl. I made an initial guess that Cat would beat Owl in the Shadowlands, but Heart of the Wilds does benefit Owl more. And here we see again, the second best DPS Conduit benefits Owl more than Cat too. We'll see how the legendaries fare, and once we've looked at each Covenant, we'll reassess the Cat versus Owl debate. Until then, thanks for watching.